The ultimate inspiration for this conference and for this whole series of conferences that we've had here over the course of the last 6 years was Sarah Smith, who was a member of our Board of Advisors, deeply committed to the issues that these conferences are supposed to address, the issue of the relevance of faith to contemporary moral issues of all sorts. More immediately, the inspiration for this conference came from an event about 4 years ago when William Sloane Coffin came to Yale to celebrate the many years of his ministry, both here and at Riverside Church. 400 people gathered in Commons downtown to celebrate that life and that ministry. Some people were there. I think, Jim, you were there. Many, I think, in this room might well have been. Yes, there we are. And we thought it was going to be a time of nostalgia, celebrating days gone by. But Bill got up and did what he always did. He gave us a sermon, and he called us to responsibility and called us to action on issues of nuclear proliferation and the peace issues of the 21st century. And that, in some ways, was his legacy to us. That is, that we needed to take responsibility for these issues that are on the table for this conference. That sowed a seed, and that seed was planted in the Center for Faith and Culture, and under the leadership of Miroslav Volf, the director and founder of the Center for Faith and Culture, this conference emerged as one of a series of Sarah Smith conferences. I'm looking forward to the conversations that we're going to have tonight and tomorrow. It's an extraordinarily important topic and an extraordinarily timely topic, and one that we might lose sight of in this environment where there are so many other things calling for our attention, including the demise of various capital markets, etc. But unless we attend to nuclear proliferation and the peace issues that surround it, our future could be very bleak indeed. So I'd like now to call upon Miroslav Volf to give us an introduction to the conversations that are going to be taking place tonight and tomorrow, and I look forward to meeting all of you individually during the course of this conference. Thank you for being here. Miroslav.
Is that my name here? I think it is. I'll take this seat, which will be mine during the panel discussion, but before we come to that, I want to issue my own word of welcome to all of you who are gathered here. Yale Center for Faith and Culture is very pleased to organize these kinds of conferences where we can think about great and sometimes troubling issues of the day and try to shed some light from faith as well as from a wide variety of disciplines on the subject matter at hand. And before I say a few words, I think mainly about how, in addition to the impulse from the source, eminent source that Harry has described, also in our own thinking, the question of security and vulnerability was shaped. I just want to express my gratitude to a number of people who deserve gratitude for an event of this sort. Of course, Smith family has already been thanked for faithfully supporting these events, but I want to mention some of the members of my own staff who have worked very tirelessly. For you, this is now you're here. From them, this is a long way of pushing a stone up a relatively steep hill occasionally. And I don't know whether all of them are here, but Jan Odell, the assistant to the, Jan Odell is there, Secretarial Help. And just about everything else that needs to be done, Jan does. Sven is also somewhere there. He's not. He's working very appropriately, right? Somebody who we have seconded as our advisor, but who ended up working a lot for us, was Tyler Stevenson. Some of you know him here. He's passionate about the question of nuclear non-proliferation. And without him, this conference could not take place. Tyler, where are you? There you are. Thank you. And of course, my very able executive director of the Yale Center for Faith and Culture, acting executive director, Roseanne Moore. Roseanne has worked hard hours. Stand up, Roseanne, if you can. And she's worked not only hard hours, but she's worked hard hours with bad back, you know, and that's so much more to her credit. Sven is right there next to Jen, so thank. So maybe a few words just for you to have a sense of how this topic shaped itself in our own imagination, and then translated into invitation to have a conference of this sort. The title is Vulnerability and Security in an Anxious Age, and it's these two things together that we are trying to think. Why security? Well, why security? That seems so obvious. We live in an insecure world, and probably no other event as much as 9/11 has brought that to our public consciousness. Anything could happen, anytime it could happen, and our lives could change, and our livelihood can be endangered in profound ways. But of course, 9/11 did not create an insecure world. It became for us only an indicator, a symptom of an insecure world in which we live. Now, and it's also true that human beings have always lived with insecurity. And yet, in the contemporary world, in the modern world, we have a peculiar forms of insecurities, vulnerabilities that we need to attend. And I think it's probably right to say, maybe some of you sociologists might disagree with me, but it's probably right to say that we live in what Ulrich Beck and Anthony Giddens have called risk society. And by risk society, they mean that unlike in previous eras, where a majority of our risk came from natural sources, they were natural risk, we live today in what they called society of manufactured risk. It's a risk produced by human activity, and above all, it concerns technological innovation. And because with technological innovation, we are entering always new situations. They're unpredictable situations, and we do not quite know how the results of our own activity, what kinds of risks we are going to incur by our own activities. Example, 9/16/2008, that's about 2 days ago, right? News summary. Higher levels of chemical, often found in plastic food and drink packaging, are associated with cardiovascular disease and diabetes, right? So you can see that, right? Obviously something that seemed innocuous as an innovation potentially has significant risk. That's just a symbol of the kind of situation in which we find ourselves. The greater technological prowess, the more risk character society takes. And maybe because we live in risk society, a society in which risk is produced by human activity, I think we are also then increasingly averse to risk. If human activity creates risk, human activity can also prevent risks. Hence, I think we insist on high margins of security. Children getting off and on school buses are protected. Workers repairing our roads are protected, often with flashing cars or police cars. Homes are protected. Businesses, well, I won't go into businesses, right? Especially large-scale protection that has just occurred, right? Bailouts that some of you may have an opinion or two about. Nations, of course, are being protected, and one of the main functions of governments is precisely to securitize a nation. And in many cases, which is, I think, consonant with the idea of enlarging the margins of security, in many cases the goal is reduction of risk, and reduction of risk to the point of inviolability, so that the loss of any life is one life lost too many. A loss of anything is loss that we cannot quite accept. And from, I think, one perspective that seems like a natural most natural of all goals. Why should one not seek inviolability? Why should not one seek total security? But can we achieve it? And more importantly, I think, is at what cost can we achieve the levels of security even lower than that of inviolability? And what costs not just of economic nature, but what costs of human nature can we achieve those goals? Now, as we observe these dimensions of security situation in which we find ourselves across the broad spectrum of our life, we also, being at a theological school, try to take a look to religious and faith theological traditions, what they might have to say about security. And to our surprise, we found very little reflection on such fundamental issue as is security. Now, it's not that we didn't find primary religious statements on security, right, in the tradition and in the scriptures from which our traditions are based. Take a look at Psalms, for instance. Psalmists often praise to God who is my refuge, right? What is that? Then thematizing security in God. Or take a look not at the Hebrew Bible, or as we Christians call it, Old Testament, but take a look at the very end of the Bible. It ends with this image of New Jerusalem. And if you carefully read about this New Jerusalem, it is a city that is utterly and completely secured, right? The city which can never be conquered, it is a city which can never be undone. Security is a very important theme in biblical traditions, but theologians have slept as they've read those portions of the Bible. We haven't taken up that issue of security, so we thought it's important for us to first reflect on our own about this and possibly see what religious reflection, what kind of contribution it might make to wider debate about security. So why then, that's why security, but why vulnerability? Now, vulnerability obviously is the reason why we pursue security. If we were not vulnerable, the question of security would never arise. I'm a theologian, and presumably I can say with some degree of confidence that God needs no security force, right, to protect God's throne. God is by definition inviolable. Human beings are not by definition inviolable. We need our existence and our well-being secured. That is why those lights flash on the buses when kids go off and on. That is why we lock our homes at night and sometimes also during the day. That is why we have police force and so on and so on. But vulnerability touches upon security in also another way. It places, I think, human vulnerability. It places also a limit to the pursuit of security. And I think it determines in part, or it shapes in part at least, the nature of what it means to be secure. I think vulnerability is fundamental to who we are as human beings. To be inviolable is to be divine. To be human is to be, and I think is always to remain, vulnerable. You can put it almost this way, that vulnerability is the essential condition of human life. No vulnerability, no adequately understood human life. Now that has very important implications for what it means to pursue then security. In places, I think, certain limits to security. We tend to think the more secure we are, the better off we will be. But can vulnerable persons be ever fully secure? Can we ever create conditions of inviolability? Isn't it for vulnerable creatures to be inviolable a contradiction in terms? And if we could, would it be desirable to create conditions in which we would be fully secured? Could we create? Would it be good to create a world of total security? What kind of world would it be? What implications would it have for freedom and unpredictability that is related to fundamentally to our freedom? What implications would it have for interdependence of human beings that qualifies us as human beings? Wouldn't an inviolability be equivalent to being in a fortress and an individual independent, at least in possibility of being independent of others? So that's the question of vulnerability and the limits of security. But I think vulnerability is related also to the forms of security. If I say things rightly, to a large degree, we seek security by deployment of power aided by technology. And there are obvious problems that are related with that, and one of the problems is that when we do that, I suspect that we reinforce the competitive relationship that always exists between the object that needs to be secured and the threat, or the person who threatens that object. And that's an inherently unstable situation. The means of security call forth ways of undermining that security, and new ways of undermining security demand new means in order to achieve security. And so there's this potential of an escalating threat, and therefore potentially of increased vulnerability. There's problem two. In a technologically driven situation, in a risk society, the means of securitization potentially and often actually create their own risks. And one of the reasons why we have decided to go with the question of nuclear question in the context of discussions of vulnerability and security is because this is, in a sense, a paradigmatic case of that situation. Nuclear weapons are a prime example of presumed means of security morphing into a clear threat to security. There's risk in possessing them, risk to the possessor of them and the larger society. There is risk in them falling into the wrong hands. As Mikhail Gorbachev has put in 2007, it is becoming clearer that nuclear weapons are no longer a means of achieving security. In fact, with every passing year, they make our security more precarious. That too is the characteristic of management of risk in technologically driven situation of a risks society. So stepping back in our reflection, here's what we thought about as an important issue. Well, how do we as inherently vulnerable beings living in a risk society, how do we secure ourselves? And how do we secure ourselves with broader means than just technological? So our big questions which were raised for us as we pursued this conference were what human loss is entailed in pursuing security to the point of inviolability? What modes and means of security beyond use of power aided by technology are appropriate to beings for whom vulnerability belongs to the very character of their being? What contribution, that's the third question, what contribution can religious traditions, in particular in our case the Christian faith, make to rethinking of the security issue given our inherent vulnerability and inherent risks attended to in the kind of risk societies in which we live? Those are kind of the broad set of questions that guided us as we thought about the question of vulnerability and security. And as I already indicated, a question of nuclear non-proliferation is almost like a test case of the situation in which we find ourselves today. Now, I want to thank all of you, and especially the speakers, and tonight especially the members of the panel, for joining us in grappling with these issues. As you see, I have mainly questions and I have no answers whatsoever. So we are here to think through some of those issues, and we are here to think through them centered on the question of nuclear non-proliferation. Now, let me introduce our distinguished panel, and then I will give you the question which we have all posed them to answer. I'll ask them to give a 5-minute response to the question we have asked them to answer, and then we'll hopefully have a time for them to discuss among themselves, and then open it up to the floor for the rest of us to participate. So may I ask our guests to come, and then I'll introduce each one of them. Or maybe easier, yeah, please. Do you know, let's see, that's good. You're right here, Nail's right here. There we go. This is a little bit, I should have.
I guess we can move these around if we had.
We could, that's right. Now, our apologies, we should have had these signs written on both sides. Yeah. So let me introduce our distinguished panel in the alphabetical order. Scott Bader-Saye, is that how you pronounce your name?
Yes.
Thank you. Is an associate professor of theological ethics at the University of Scranton in Scranton, Pennsylvania. He holds a PhD from Duke University and an MD from this distinguished institution, and a BA from Davidson College. His most recent publication is Following Jesus in a Culture of Fear. In addition to teaching, Professor Bader-Saye serves as abbot of Piecemeal, an emerging Episcopal community in Scranton. Thank you for coming.
Thanks, good to be here.
I'm going to butcher some names, I have full understanding for that because my name gets virtually always butchered, except in Slavic countries. Naila Bolus? Naila.
Very close.
Very good. Oh, almost. Naila Bolus is the executive director of Ploughshares Fund, a public grant-making foundation with offices in San Francisco and Washington, D.C., focused on preventing the spread and use of nuclear weapons and promoting regional stability. She has been co-director of 2020 Vision, a national grassroots organization dedicated to revitalizing democracy, and helped found WILL, the Women's Legislators Lobby. She holds a BA in International Relations from Tufts University. Paul Bracken.
Got it right.
To my left. I'll get there with some names at least. He's a professor of management and professor of political science at the Yale School of Management, a leading expert in global competition and the strategic application of technology in business and defense. His most recent book is Managing Strategic Surprise: Lessons from Risk Assessment and Risk Management. Professor Bracken holds PhD from Yale and BS from Columbia. John Lewis Gaddis, I did that okay too? Right, good. Is Robert Lovett Professor of History at Yale University. He teaches course in Cold War history, grand strategy, international studies, and biography. He holds PhD from the University of Texas and has published numerous books, of which the most recent is The Cold War and Surprise, Security, and the American Experience. And then Commander Raag, Rolfsen? Raag. Ah, that's Raag. There's an E there. That's very good. He is the head of the Department of Education and Research for the Norwegian Military Chaplaincy and is the leader of the Commission on International Affairs for the Church of Norway's Council on Ecumenical and International Relations. Currently at work on a doctoral degree on Emmanuel Levinas philosophy, he holds degrees in theology from the Norwegian School of Theology and in philosophy from the University of Oslo. His most recent publication you will see in his CV, which I will not know how to pronounce, but some of you may know how to read. So those of you who do, check it out. It's in Norwegian. So I want to thank all of you for coming and joining me here in at this panel. And as I have mentioned, we have sent to each one of these members of the panel, we have sent them a question and asked them to make an initial statement of about 5 minutes in response to this question. And here's the question. What role, if any, does vulnerability play in constructing security in the second nuclear age, meaning the nuclear age after the Cold War? And maybe we should start from my left and travel to the right. Is that okay?
Yes, that's okay. Thank you very much, Professor Volf. Let me start by saying how honored I am to be here at Yale and at this important conference. I will also start by excusing my English, which is not my first language, but I'll do as good as I can. Let me go straight to a question that was mentioned. What role, if any, does vulnerability play in constructing security in the second nuclear age? I hope that a question was formulated to be provocative, for to me it is obvious that vulnerability plays a role in constructing security, and I think you, Professor, answered it very good in your introduction. To me it is obvious that vulnerability plays such a role. To start with, all weapons acquire their force from human vulnerability. The purpose of weapons is to hurt human beings. Vulnerability is the sense-giving, essential human feature that gives anything such as weapons and war its meaning or its meaninglessness. This is the obvious and logical part. But, and this is the part we should start to reflect upon, this is much more than logic. There is a qualitative difference between demolishing an empty building and killing a human being. Humans are vulnerable in an altogether different sense. The role of human vulnerability in the constitution of human existence as human digs a lot deeper than its necessary role with regard to the effectiveness of weapons. The possibility of being affected, of being hurt, encountered, squeezed, hugged, and kissed, all that falls under the exposedness connected to the term vulnerability. Vulnerability is the original or even pre-original site of human meaning. We need to return to this foundational ethical site also in our political thinking, so that our thinking does not become only calculations. And if you now reformulate the above proposition to say all meaningful human action acquires its strength from human vulnerability, then we see that the logical weapons and the logical nuclear weapons in particular both presuppose vulnerability and aims at destroying its own presupposition. The goal of weapons is not to destruct a matter, but to eliminate vulnerability as such. It is this aim that is taken to the extreme in nuclear weapons. In a framework such as the one we have been working on inside the Church of Norway, where vulnerability is perceived as being more basic than security. Nuclear weapons signal the end term of a self-destructive development existing at the core of what we usually call Western metaphysics. In a perverted logic, ultimate security and ultimate insecurity merge. The driving force of this development, in my view, is a reductionist and flawed concept of security, where security, as has already been mentioned here, has been identified with invulnerability. Security politics has been driven by a dream of invulnerability. This reductionist concept of security has been possible to maintain, although at the cost of terrible wars, as long as security primarily meant state security. Provided that the state was secured, the strength of vulnerability, that of care, community, respect and love, could exist within the borders of the state. In our globalized age, this approach is no longer tenable. The heyday of political realism is over. Our security is no longer only national. Global finance, global warming, global migration, the global significance and proliferation of nuclear weapons, all this wakes us up to a shared and global sense of vulnerability. 9/11, as was already mentioned as well, was in fact a sign of this shared vulnerability. The reaction of the US administration regretfully did not build its approach on this significance. President Bush never tired of repeating, we learned a harsh lesson, and that is that oceans can no longer protect us from those who hate America. The security concept identifying security and invulnerability was the one prevailing. The security as separation guiding US foreign policy since the Monroe Doctrine, and which natural barriers had guaranteed in earlier times, should now, in the age of genuine globalization, be achieved through the use of superior force. The crisis that we go through at this very moment should again remind us of our globally shared vulnerability and take that as the point of departure also with regard to how we meet the nuclear threat. So to conclude, human vulnerability has everything to do with security in the second nuclear age. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Professor Gaddis.
Well, I think I probably won't surprise anybody here by wanting to say one or two words about the first nuclear age, which of course was the Cold War. And there are a lot of lessons to be learned from that experience. That's half a century of experience with security, vulnerability, and the presence of nuclear weapons. The lessons are not easily learned. The lessons are complex. The lessons are sometimes surprising. They are sometimes paradoxical. Let me discuss two saintly figures from the Cold War, since this is a divinity school, who were very sensitive to these issues. One saintly figure accepted the notion of vulnerability as inescapable, and indeed said, as you have suggested, that vulnerability can only, security can only lie in vulnerability, total, absolute vulnerability. That saintly figure was Robert Strange McNamara, the Secretary of Defense in the Kennedy and Johnson administrations, who more than anyone else implemented the strategy of mutually assured destruction with the appropriate acronym MAD, which literally assumed this, that the important thing with both superpowers having piled up vast quantities of nuclear weapons was to ensure that the cities and the humanity, the people of both populations, Soviet and American, be totally vulnerable And that would be the path to security. Only through that terror, only through that fear, could nuclear weapons, could it be guaranteed that nuclear weapons would never be used. So a saintly figure, someone who would have qualified for a position at a theological school. One doesn't think of McNamara in quite that way, but the paradoxes of the Cold War were such that this is where he was going. And his thinking did not emerge from reading Niebuhr. It did not emerge from reading theologians. It emerged from some of the most cold-blooded, realistic think tanks of strategic studies in this country who came up with that idea. My other saintly figure is someone during the Cold War who said this is totally immoral, this idea of mutual assured destruction. But this idea of holding hostage the populations of the world to that kind of terror goes against the dictates of God and common sense and humanity and morality and everything else. And this saintly figure fundamentally and dramatically and effectively challenged the concept of mutual assured destruction. But again, we don't often think of him as a saintly figure. I rather doubt that he is thought of here as a saintly figure. I'm talking, of course, about Ronald Reagan, the President of the United States, who did more than anyone else to undermine the concept of mutual assured destruction by challenging its fundamental premises that security could come by these immoral and terrifying means, and consequently raising the possibility of building strategic defenses, consequently challenging the conventional wisdom that virtually everybody, including Soviet defense experts and intellectuals by that time, had bought into during the Cold War. And it was Reagan who said, "This emperor has no clothes. This makes no sense. There is no logic. There is no morality in this." Which saintly figure most moves my students today? Which saintly figure do they find persuasive today? They think Reagan is a hero. They think mutual assured destruction is the dumbest idea they ever heard. How could people have believed that back then? This is my greatest challenge as a teacher of Cold War history, is to explain how so many people could have believed that back then. Now, I raise all of these points, just to encourage a certain humility on your part, which is always good for us. But I think particularly it's good for us in dealing with these kinds of issues, because I think we too easily lock these kinds of issues into political stereotypes and fail to see that conventional wisdom can sometimes take hold with such rigidity and with such blindness as to lock us in to something that appears to be common sense, when it should not be, and when it really isn't, and when future generations will not so regard it. So that's the paradox I would just like to throw out to you from the first nuclear age, is that we approach the second nuclear age with the spirit of humility, with the spirit of not locking ourselves into preconceptions about who is going to be on which side, into not locking ourselves into preconceptions as to what is a liberal position and what is a conservative position on these issues. So I think that's where I'd like to leave it. Miroslav.
Thank you.
Good. All right. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having me with this august panel. And my answer to the question is, I would agree with the two previous two speakers, that vulnerability plays an enormous, indeed the central role when it comes to nuclear weapons. And would underscore the phrasing of the question that we are in something called a second nuclear age, which wasn't supposed to happen if we had played our cards right at the end of the first nuclear age, but here we are. Okay, and this raises the question about where this is going to go. And when I ask myself as to who might get the bomb in the coming years, I can imagine a wide band of possibilities of who might get it and who might not, except one, and that's disarmament, which I find completely unimaginable given the current world political situation and for the foreseeable future. So it seems to me that we are going to have to go through a second nuclear age. What does the what are some of the distinguishing characteristics of this? I'd like to refer to a couple of, I think, truly saintly individuals of the first nuclear age of the Cold War.
War of saints here.
And
Competition for saints.
one is a gentleman by the name of Thomas Merton, who wrote a book called Peace in the Post-Christian Era, which was apparently bottled up by the Catholic. Written in 1962, it appeared in 2004. Had a complex path to publication through the Catholic Church. You can read about it in the extensive introduction to the book. Merton uses this phrase, demonic complexity, to really capture the incredible complexities of deterrence, and should you shoot at cities, and is it okay to possess nuclear weapons as long as you don't use them, or is it okay to, does the Augustinian tradition allow you to threaten but then not use nuclear weapons? And he sort of throws up his hands at the ends of this book and has his own views, but I think this notion of complexity, indeed demonic complexity, applies with even greater force to the second nuclear age for reasons I've written about elsewhere. Briefly, the wider number of actors with culture and historical traditions very different from ours. I would add this intense and real uncertainty from complexity, not just for actors moving parts, profound about what countries, terrorist groups try to get what they would do. And my own view is I don't really have any answers to what to do about this. But I think it's time to raise the level of conversation on these important issues, which I tend to be ones of safety and morality. My view is that the discussion about these issues in the last 10 to 20 years in the United States, after the end of the Cold War, has gotten to a dangerously low level of discourse. All right. It's simply almost a caricature of a debate. The level of discussion in the Cold War brought to address these fundamentally important issues by people like Thomas Merton, by Catholic realists like John Courtney Murray, by nuclear strategists who broke the hold of the statist hold on the whole discourse of these things when Tom Schelling, Bernard Brodie, and Herman Kahn started to write about it. You may not agree with them, but they broke the hold, the monopoly of the conversation of the United States government, wrapped in secrecy. And only then did we have a serious conversation about these things in the 1960s. This tradition continued into the early 1980s with the Catholic bishops' marvelous letter, pastoral letter on war and peace, which I had some small hand in working with. So there is a rich tradition here, which I think powerfully informed the debate of these issues in the first nuclear age. My argument is that I haven't seen only the beginnings of this. I see a certain number of signs that this is turning. There's a fascinating article in a magazine called Joint Forces Quarterly, which I doubt many people in here read. It's published by the National Defense University. And in the current issue, which if you Google it, you can find it, it's on the web, there's an article by the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral Michael Mullen, talking about the need to rethink deterrence. And what he's saying is pleading for the country to have a debate and a discourse on these issues because they're above his pay grade. He can't possibly solve these things. So my hope that this conference will be a part of a shift to a more productive conversation, which I have not seen. I will just conclude by the lament that we use the term think tank, and to these institutions on K Street, they're all now inside the Washington Beltway, supposed to be thinking about these things. These institutions have only the palest connection to the think tanks of the Cold War, in my view. They're far more ideological, gripped in the hands of people who fund them, and write pieces with a maximum word length of 600 words, because that's all the Washington Post will accept in their op-ed pieces. So my plea is to have this could be the start of a broader conversation, which is desperately needed if we're to have any hope of addressing these issues. And that the Catholic traditions, I don't mean to overdo the Catholic thing, but I am one, and it materially influenced the debate of the late 50s and early 60s. killing one weapon system after another. A huge impact on war policies. So leave it at that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm very honored to be part of this panel and to be part of this discussion of these very important questions. And I reflected walking in here, somewhat to my delight, that this is the first audience to which I don't actually have to explain that the origins of the name Ploughshares Fund, my foundation, actually come from Isaiah and not a farming implement. But I want to reflect a little bit on how vulnerability and how we're thinking about vulnerability in this second nuclear age is catalyzing a totally radical and dramatic conversation and thinking among conservatives and among unusual allies about how we achieve security in this new environment, namely the achievement of a nuclear weapons-free world, or making progress towards a nuclear weapons-free world. Now, conservatives, and it's been mentioned here, I mean, many of us sort of saw the defining event of the second nuclear age as September 11th. It wasn't a nuclear attack, but it exposed our vulnerability and really starkly illustrated the limits of deterrence. So many articles after September 11th were published that posed the question, and still, in fact, still today, we just a week ago marked the anniversary, that posed the question, what if they had the bomb? And about a year ago, Republican Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was speaking to a conference at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University, kind of summed it up this way, simply. He said that nuclear weapons are back, or the nuclear threat is back with a vengeance, the vengeance of a terrorist. Is there any doubt that terrorists would use these weapons? And I think the fact that there are several thousand metric tons of fissile material, nuclear weapons material, highly enriched uranium and plutonium, enough for some, perhaps 100,000 nuclear warheads scattered around the globe, that exacerbates our vulnerability. And this second nuclear age, the world now is much more unpredictable, right? There are regional conflicts, there are regional tensions in areas where nuclear weapons are now a factor. There are new nuclear weapon states. There are still thousands of nuclear weapons in the world. There's information that we have gotten evidence of a flourishing nuclear black market. And the more nuclear weapons spread, the more likely they'll be used and not so much just seen as a deterrent. So all of these vulnerabilities together have catalyzed this radical thinking that I referred to in the beginning from a set of former Cold Warriors and people that Professor Gaddis mentioned also. I mean, Ronald Reagan talked about his goal at the Reykjavik summit was a world free of nuclear weapons. So 20 years after that first Reykjavik summit, there was a conference held, and these former Cold Warriors got together, and they drafted and published a remarkable op-ed in the Wall Street Journal, actually, which was longer than 600 words, and then again in 2008, where they called for a renewed effort and a commitment towards a nuclear weapons-free world, and a set of very practical steps, a roadmap to get us from here to there. Who are these people? Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, Sam Nunn, and Bill Perry. And what they have done is launched a global conversation, sort of turned this whole idea of vulnerability and security on its head, based on this fundamental belief that we are worse off, countries are worse off, we as in our own national security interest are worse off with nuclear weapons than in a world without them. That's dramatic. They have gotten 17 of the living former Secretaries of State, Defense, and National Security Advisors to sign on to their commitment. That's 70% of the people who have served in these offices that are still alive. That's remarkable to me. People like James Baker, like Frank Carlucci, like Lawrence Eagleburger, all Republicans. I haven't mentioned a Democrat yet. There are Democrats who've signed on as well. But it shows the real bipartisan strength of this effort. And global leaders have agreed as well. So you had Margaret Beckett, the former Foreign Secretary of the UK, give a remarkable speech where she committed the United Kingdom to lead in a global disarmament effort. And Prime Minister Gordon Brown has echoed that. You've heard these kinds of things from other global leaders. And what I think makes this moment so different and hopeful, without sounding naive, is that there's also a robust civil society that is working alongside. Sometimes we think about this image of these, they're called the Four Horsemen or the Gang of Four, or things that have four in them. And they're sort of seen like this snowplow, sort of moving this debate forward. And alongside and supporting them are all these civil society efforts. And I'll just mention two, because Tyler was called out earlier today, and his network, Faithful Security, is bringing together people from different faiths who are moved by the notion that the stewardship of human creation and human creation as sort of the fundamental principle, and they are working together to both on the steps towards and the vision of a nuclear weapons-free world. And there's another effort that we're also supporting. We're supporting Tyler's effort as well. That's called Global Zero. And this is also an amazing initiative where global leaders from all parts of the world have come together and signed on to this commitment. They're conducting diplomacy with their counterparts in other countries, and there's a major media effort going along with it precisely to raise the debate. There's a film that they're producing that is being produced by the same people who produce An Inconvenient Truth. And the whole goal of this effort is to move towards a nuclear compact that will actually commit nations to eliminate nuclear weapons by a date certain. And so this is something different. This is something that we haven't seen before. This is historic. And we've seen it for the first time that in this country, both the Republican and the Democratic candidates for president have both endorsed the vision of a nuclear weapons-free world. Will we get there in my lifetime? I don't know. But as Sam Nunn talks about, he says, maybe I can't see the top of the mountain, but we have to take steps to get there. And Foreign Secretary Beckett, in her speech, she talked about the road that we're walking down and the importance of walking down, taking the steps toward the end of that road. And she said that, for any generation, this would be an important calling, but for ours, it's a duty. So we have this moment, this opportunity where we can all be part of this conversation, where we can all contribute to it. And as we do, I think we will profoundly impact the security of future generations. So I'll stop there.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all. Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here and to be able to be part of this conversation. I'm glad that the four previous panelists actually answered the question as written, because my tack is slightly different, which is to say that we might reframe the question somewhat. The question, again, is what role, if any, does vulnerability play in constructing security in the second nuclear age? But it seems to me this question suggests that vulnerability is one among many possible tactics to get us to security, or perhaps not. I want to flip the question just a bit and ask this. What kinds of vulnerability must we accept in order to pursue those goods that are greater than our security? So what kinds of vulnerability must we accept in order to pursue those goods that are greater than our security? In other words, is self-preservation an end in itself, whether that's self being preserved as an individual, a community, a tribe, a nation? I think for most of us the answer is no, that self-preservation is not its own end. That is, we seek to preserve the self, the body, corporate or individual, in order to achieve certain goods that are themselves greater than simply surviving. Which means that, in fact, there are goods for which we are willing to take risks. Certainly in the Christian tradition, we understand human life as participating in a calling that involves risk. Christians live not for the sake of living, but in order to reflect the self-giving love of the Trinity and our own relations of receptive generosity. Such love, then, requires a kind of vulnerability to the other that is thwarted if our highest goal becomes self-protection. Jesus makes quite clear that finding our lives will require losing them. And if we are too intent on saving our lives, we will never find them. And so courage then becomes a crucial virtue, not simply because it helps us face our fears, but because courage helps us fend off the temptation to make security our highest good. Thus, courage helps us keep fear at bay long enough to pursue the goods that constitute human flourishing. Courage, whether it's understood paradigmatically as Aristotle thought in the role of the soldier, or as Aquinas thought in the life of the martyr, courage remains intimately tied to vulnerability. Because courage is the willingness to make oneself vulnerable to a threat in order to pursue a good that represents a higher call. Thus, the desire to be invulnerable is not courage, but an attempt to make courage unnecessary. Now, the question of how we name and rank those higher goods in a liberal democracy is a difficult question, given that liberalism as a political theory prescinds from judgments about substantive goods. What this leaves us with, unfortunately, is the tendency to embrace a liberalism of fear, in which we allow fear to become the glue that binds us together. We may not know what goods we want to pursue together. We may not find agreement on that. But we may agree that we have certain fears in common. And so fear becomes the glue that holds us together. But of course, what this requires is that the fear continue to be sort of spurred on. That is, if we want to find greater and greater unity, we need to become more and more afraid. Right? So there's something sort of problematic about making fear the center of what draws us together. But in a pluralistic democracy, I think we do not need to be silent about substantive goods. As Jeff Stout has pointed out, democracy at its best houses a multiplicity of sub-communities which carry forward thick descriptions of what human flourishing looks like. So far from excluding these varied accounts of the good from the public conversation, democracy functions best when it nurtures the practices of listening and tending to these varied goods, and so helping us discover goods that we share in common. The conversation about the common good then can serve as a kind of antidote to a liberalism of fear that helps us make judgments about what ends we wish to pursue and the vulnerabilities necessary to pursue them. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, writing to Reinhold Niebuhr in 1939, at the time he was in New York City, he was making a determination to return to Germany. He said this in his letter: "I shall have no right to participate in the reconstruction of Christian life in Germany after the war if I do not share the trials of this time with my people. Christians in Germany will face the terrible alternative of either willing the defeat of their nation in order that Christian civilization may survive, or willing the victory of their nation and thereby destroying our civilization. I know which of these alternatives I must choose, but I cannot make this choice in security." What's interesting here is not simply that Bonhoeffer is willing to embrace danger, a threat to his own life, in the name of a higher cause, but that he was willing to work to make his nation more vulnerable, since the survival of the nation was not as important to him as the survival of a certain kind of civilization that was in principle separable from the security of any particular state. So, in the end, I think the most important question may be how can vulnerability play a role, and not how can vulnerability play a role in security, but rather how can we keep our desire for security from threatening the goods that exceed mere survival? Politically, then, we have to ask the question, can torture or the stockpiling of weapons of mass destruction or preemptive war or the denial of rights to enemy combatants be consistent with human flourishing and the flourishing of democracy? Or do such practices undertaken in the name of security actually diminish our humanity and that of others to the extent that we may stay alive, but we'll hardly stay human?
Thank you. Rich feast we have had prepared for us. I have lots of questions swirling in my head, which I would like to ask. But maybe I should give a chance to the panel participants to ask each other questions. And if you stall, I'll jump into your rescue and to the rescue of the session. But if any of you have questions to ask of each other, I think that would be a good place to begin, because this should be a conversation between you here.
Well, I might butcher a name here, and I'm sorry, our first panelist. Raag?
Yes.
Raag. Okay. Thank you. I just wanted to ask if you might expand. You mentioned the heyday of political realism is over. And I wonder if you might expand on what you mean by that.
Yes, I'll try. What I mean is, I think, and this might be somewhat provocative here in the US, but in one way, the USA has been a latecomer to an insight of this shared vulnerability, because you have been strong and you've been able to control your own hemisphere. Not with all the right means all the time, but you have. So you have, in a way here, you have, in a way, preserved the notion that isolationism is possible. But the more and more globalization comes in, isolationism becomes expensive, because you have to control the things that can't make you live isolated. So I think I think what is happening now with global warming, with a financial crackdown, and all these things that shows that we are part of a common world, will eventually make us agree on that multilateral way to meet the challenges that we have today is the only one, the only way that we can work. So that is what I mean by the realism has really been over long time ago, but now you might also start to realize that that is the truth here in this country. Sorry.
How do we know when we're being realistic in the first place? You know, I would like to see a realistic definition of realism. This term is used very easily in the academic world, and the assumption always lies behind it that unrealism is somehow pejorative. Whatever the opposite of realism is, somehow you get a lot more credibility by being a realist. Academic world, think tank world, no doubt in the political world as well. But I have never quite known what realism is. I know that Paul Bracken and his political science colleagues can give us certain well-defined and well-understood categories for how you would distinguish a realist from what? A liberal, an idealist, whatever?
You don't want to know.
But I'm not completely satisfied with these terms. Let me just throw you 3 examples of the complicated character of this question. First of all, go back to the beginning. Was it realistic to develop nuclear weapons in the first place? Why was that done? What were they for? Well, they were actually built to win a war. It was a good war. It was a war worthy of fighting, as Bonhoeffer said. They were effective in winning that war. They saved lives. The Japanese would not have surrendered as quickly. More lives would have been lost from strategic bombing if these weapons had not been. I think even Japanese historians would acknowledge this today. So a complex moral case can be made for this. Is that realistic? Good question. Then look at the role of nuclear weapons throughout the Cold War itself. One of the things that is not often acknowledged frequently enough about the Cold War is precisely that it was not a hot war, that there were no great power wars, and there are not likely to be any more great power wars. Now, Think about world history. Think about the history of the international state system, which goes back at least 500 years and has been riddled with great power wars. Something happened in the last half of the 20th century that made great power war unthinkable. What was it? Was it pacifism? I'm not sure. Was it militarism? I'm not sure. Was it nuclear weapons? I'm pretty sure that that was one of the big differences that confronted everybody, and so had that kind of effect, a kind of idealistic purpose, a moral purpose served by brutal means, and in this sense paralleling Hiroshima and Nagasaki, it seems to me. But then ask yourself the third question: what are nuclear weapons for today? What purposes do they serve? And to my mind, operating in a very different international system from the Cold War, operating in a system in which wars between rational actors are not the issue. Wars between irrationalities, competing irrationalities, and by that I mean a sense of not having a single rationality, of having multiple rationalities, multiple realisms. If you think about the different communities in the world today and how they would define that term, realism, it's a very different thing from the Cold War. So my own case, my own view, would be precisely yours. That the realistic thing to do now is to ensure that these things are never used again. And I'm glad they were used once, so that everybody understood what they were and what they did. I'm very glad they were not used in the Cold War. That was one of the most remarkable things about that half-century experience. And I think now, if I had to pick a priority, it would be to ensure that the progress made morally during the Cold War would not be taken lightly, would not be disregarded lightly, and would be preserved. And I think this is what these great conservative figures, these Cold Warriors, have come around to. And certainly the person I'm working on, George Kennan, had come around to this as early as like 1949 or so. So I come back to the question, what really is realism under these circumstances?
Good. Spice has been placed into the stew. now we can continue more actively. Since you want to quickly respond, and
yes,
I know Paul wants to.
will only respond that I put into realism the in a way classical realism of Morgenthau and Kenneth Waltz. That is what I that there is. That the international system...
Morgenthau, Waltz, and Kennan, some people would say.
Yes.
Totally wrong, yes. Some people would say.
But and that the international system of states, in a way, will reach a kind of a balance without any supranational forces and so on. And I think that is the age that is now over. And I can give you a quote from Morgenthau, who says, an age whose objective conditions of existence have been radically transformed by the possibility of nuclear death evades the need for a radical transformation of its thought and action by thinking and acting as though nothing radical importance had happened.
But I would just come back to that and say this radical transformation of thought has taken place. That's what the Cold War was all about. And it didn't happen through institutions. It happened through fear, which caused everybody to rethink the nature of the international system. And I think we don't acknowledge that side of the Cold War frequently enough. I'll stop, Miroslav.
Paul.
Just briefly, I mean, if anybody wants a discourse on international relations theory, I'd be happy to oblige. But trust me, most of the audience, including me, doesn't want that. No, but I've long, Morgenthau is held up as this ultra-realist, which is bad. And one of the things that's happened in the political science discourse, to get back to my point about the lower level of conversation, if Morgenthau read what he's attributed to have believed, he would not know that that it was supposed to be about him. The academic community has created a grotesque caricature of realism, embodied in making figures who were actually quite moderate, like Morgenthau, I think. I mean, how you could get your man in there, I don't see at all. But but they create a caricature, And so this caricature is mirrored with caricatures in the policy debate, which turns me to my question for Naila, which is why don't any of these guys, who I know very well, ever do anything about this when they're in office?
I don't know the answer to that. And, I mean, you're exactly right. And I think, that it will be the test this time with both Obama and McCain, who have made these commitments. Obama has actually spelled out some specific steps. He's introduced legislation. McCain done less so. But it will be the test. And I think in some ways, it's up to us, to civil society, and to the public to hold them accountable. And, as you said, the public discourse on this issue has really dissipated since the 80s. And so how do we get that back? In many ways, the environmental community has captured something, captivated something with the debate over climate change. And you can look at these two challenges, climate change and nuclear weapons, as very similar challenges. They're man-made, they're preventable, they have moral dimensions, all these kinds of things. So why is it that the environmental community has been able to get such a groundswell of public opinion and public support behind it? I think that that's changing. I think we have to be realistic that, we're not going to get 1 million people in the streets like we did during the height of the Cold War. But we can work with key constituencies like Tyler's doing, people who have particular sway with their members, and it's what's called sort of like a grass top strategy, and get them to put pressure on their members of Congress, the policyholders. But at the same time, I'm grateful that, yes, I wish they had done something when they were in office, but I'm grateful that they're coming forward now, because they do have the ability to work with their peers and to bring other people on board. You never would have seen this type of movement without George Shultz as the engine behind it.
Let's remember, though, who George Shultz worked for, because there was
that's right.
one who did something.
That is exactly right.
But Paul, you mentioned in your comments that disarmament is completely unimaginable to you, if I understood you correctly. And then there's this question: why don't they do anything when they're in the office?
Right.
Now, can you elaborate on your conviction and on the question and how they might, if at all, go together?
I would agree with almost everything that Naila has said, and there is larger growing awareness from globalization, among other things. I'm afraid this op-ed I find just sort of shameless publicity seeking of the worst kind, which doesn't address most of the reasons why there will not be disarmament, at least in the next several decades. Jim Schlesinger was a party to that and refused to sign it, and I thought he had a lot of moral courage, because they didn't raise any of the practical implementation issues in it. Now, let me emphasize, I'm absolutely in favor of having a public discourse on that, and if this leads to that, I am very much supportive of it, so in that sense. But I just come back to the fact that particularly some of these people, for Henry Kissinger to sign this thing to get rid of nuclear weapons is really, is pushing the limits, it seems to me. That he has suddenly seen the light.
Say more.
Well, because he was using nuclear weapons to signal the Soviet Union to control crises, which is the huge danger of the second nuclear age. Not that somebody's going to fire these at another city. It's going to be a Cuban Missile Crisis that goes out of control. All right, maybe he has seen the light. That's terrific. I'm really glad for him. But I think that the religious community has demonstrated a major moral contribution to thinking about the first nuclear age. I could list a whole series of actions the U.S. refused to do simply for moral reasons. The biggest weapon we ever had was 12 megatons. They came to Eisenhower and wanted to build a cobalt bomb. He absolutely threw them out of the office, and it's immoral. And I think the discourse of the time had a profound impact on that and raised the level of conversation. I don't know that we can do much more than that to actually come up with concrete answers. Maybe we can. The only other point is I'm in favor of disarmament as a long-term goal, but I think we have to really radically restructure arms control for the 21st century and not hang on to 1975 arms control as if it's going to work in the future and prevent India from going nuclear. It seems to me we have to really fundamentally rethink it. And arms control, let's recall, was invented in the 50s to distinguish it from disarmament, to have a separate business. I'm dismayed when I go and talk to the Arms Control Association and talk to their interns, and they use the terms interchangeably. They're not even aware that there was a huge battle in the 60s between the arms controllers and the disarmers.
That battle continues.
Professor Bracken, I mean, please remember who actually achieved arms control in the early 70s. Nixon and the infamous Kissinger. You're being, I think, quite unfair to Kissinger in this regard, because I think these concerns were really very deep with him. And I would also recommend, if you really want to do some research on this, in thinking about a Secretary of State who really deeply thought about and spoke about relationships between grand strategy, morality, and even theological issues. Read the speeches that Kissinger gave as Secretary of State, which nobody ever does, because everybody has this image of Kissinger, but they're there. They were given in public. Nobody read them. Henry has said since that what he should have done is to classify them top secret and leak them to the New York Times.
We will agree to disagree on this.
I wonder if I might pick up this conversation and going back to the question of realism and then bring it into some of these other comments. Because I think one of the things that the rhetoric of realism does is it suggests there is no alternative. It suggests a kind of ontological necessity. This is just what's real. So to try to propose another alternative is to be unreal. It can't be done. So it already sets up a situation rhetorically where it's very hard to propose alternatives. And it seems to me part of what that does then democratically is shut down conversation that might come from these sort of unsuspecting edges to suggest are there other alternatives. And so perhaps to bring the conversation down a bit from global talk, I think of the situation a couple years ago with the Amish school shooting. And also then to bring this back around to the church's witness. Here's a witness of a community that certainly is not realistic. If by realistic we mean that there are certain things that are just natural to us, right? We're going to want revenge and so forth. This community not only expresses forgiveness, but envelops the family, the remaining family of the shooter. And I think as the eyes of the country turn upon this small Christian community, all of a sudden there is an alternative. It's embodied. Yeah, it's small, right? It's very local. But I think in a lot of ways it's turning our attention to those small local embodiments of alternatives that allow us to break that sense that realism means there is no other alternative than sort of traditional ways of meeting violence with violence and upping the ante on violence as a means of thinking that we're becoming more secure. So I would hope that we could call attention to these sorts of small witnesses because I think that may be one of the places the church has the most powerful voice.
Let's open up the conversation further. Tyler?
Curious to hear. Thank you. I don't know if this makes any change. I was really curious to hear Professor Bracken describe the influence that moral arguments and faith arguments, which I would utterly say are not synonymous, but will proceed as if they are, had on U.S. policy in terms of developing thought about nuclear weapons, because this is the intersection at which I work, and on my more depressing days, I tend to think that morality is simply the tinsel that savvy policymakers hang on their legislation when they want to get it passed, and they want to run it past the buying sheep in their districts. So my question is, could you articulate how you see morality having played a role in the policy development of the Cold War? And then I'd ask a particular attention be paid. We're not in the Cold War anymore, as everyone well knows. We have an entirely different foreign policy with an entirely different relationship to morality and truth, I would argue, from Reagan's administration to George W. Bush's administration, entirely different dynamic going on. How you see the potential for moral arguments to play in the policy developments today?
Okay, I mean, just briefly, as the speaker on my right indicated, that I think one of the great things that the moralists did of that era, of the 1950s and 1960s, was to break the government monopoly over the dialogue. Now, other people did this as well, the strategists who went public, at great risk to themselves. But it stimulated a broader conversation. It is not generally known, I mean, names you haven't heard in a long time, that when Herman Kahn set up the Hudson Institute, he had A.J. Muste as a senior fellow in residence to get the pacifist viewpoint. Could anybody imagine that happening at the Heritage Foundation or the AEI today? They wouldn't even see the relevance of it. All right? So there was a broader conversation. It wasn't dominated by a handful of specialists. It broadened the debate because it forced the strategic thinkers to address the arguments of the Musties. And the Catholic realists in particular, like John Courtney Murray, had a huge impact on arms control as a kind of middle ground between the hawks who wanted to build missiles without much thought as to what they were doing and the unilateral disarmers on the left. And there were huge battles at this time over these people. I mean, you read Merton's book, he really is dripping in his contempt for John Courtney Murray, it seems to me. But it was good dialogue. The second question is, you know, we are in a fundamentally different political and foreign policy environment today. My view is not, it may be different, but my view is not that we have an administration who sees the utility of force as the solution to all problems, but as one who thought that they could boost history along, got into a jam far over their heads, and for the past 4 or 5 years are much more like a deer in the headlights, afraid to do anything. When they escalated the surge in Iraq, they sent in 20 or 25,000 people. When Bob McNamara escalated in Vietnam, he sent in 250,000 people. That was far more dangerous in a way. So my concern is less with mindless pursuit of security by adding more weapons. That's a theoretical possibility, which I think there was a dynamic for that in the 50s, which was broken by the arms controllers and the moral community. The insanity of that, and they won that argument. I mean, Kurt LeMay wanted, I used to interview Kurt LeMay. He died in the 80s, and I knew him well, and he wanted something like 10,000 ICBMs. It was just complete lunacy. But today, the problem, I think, is the absence of thought, the absence of a productive conversation. We don't even have the nouns, adjectives, and vocabulary the way we did, the way that developed once we got into the Cold War. I don't know if that answers it.
But here's a different paradox. Thinking about the injection of morality into Cold War history, which was the nature of your question, and thinking about how that happened and thinking about where it happened, what Paul is saying is correct. I mean, these thinkers did have a powerful influence. I don't think they had anything like as powerful an influence, though, as the influence of the first H-bomb tests. End of November 1952 for the Americans, summer of 53 for the Russians. And what is extraordinary is that the people, the scientists, the military men who witnessed these tests on both sides spoke of them in the same language. They suddenly started speaking the same language, and they were thinking about ecology. This is the moment at which ecology really comes in. Ecology is a moral concept. Ecology is a sense of the whole. And to see Russian military men and American military men using the same language, to see the scientists on both sides struck by the same thing, even struck by something so simple, but the evidence is there in both cases of birds being blinded and blown out of the sky. And this is reported on in both cases, both test sites. This is what turned Sakharov around. And this is what turned a lot of people around on the American side as well. And it fed into Eisenhower, who was well aware of this, but it also fed into, for example, Malenkov, who is someone you don't normally think of as somebody who is talking about the threat that nuclear weapons pose to the end of the prospect of the end of the world. He was one of the first to raise this, and it was right in the aftermath of the H-bomb tests. Now, how do you weigh these things? Was it a terrible thing that H-bombs were developed? Yes, absolutely. But on the other hand, H-bombs created a sense of this common morality that transcended nationality and ideology in a way that A-bombs never did. And I think that's very important. I think that paves the way for some of the other people who then came later.
Question here. We have a microphone, a rowing microphone. It would be good to use it.
Thank you. My name is Doug Roach. I'd like to pick up on comments of the panel, and particularly Mr. Gaddis and Mr. Bracken, that I discerned were trying to get to the question of truth and the intellectual basis of nuclear weapons. That's what I got out of your comments. Now, I'd like to put my argument this way. For a long time, the military leaders have said that nuclear weapons are without military value. The generals have made all sorts of statements of this. The people in morality have said that nuclear weapons are the ultimate evil. They are a gross invasion of God's jurisdiction over humanity. And latterly, legal authorities have said that nuclear weapons are illegal. Even the International Court of Justice, which said that the use of nuclear weapons would violate all aspects of humanitarian law, and only left the window open very narrowly to a self-defense, but certainly not the use of nuclear weapons as a preemptive strike. So we have here the highest, most reputable authorities in military, morality, and law saying nuclear weapons are without standing. In the last couple of years, I've been thinking of a fourth dimension of this. And I am emboldened to make this comment because we are sitting here in the midst of an academic institution. And as I see academic institutions, they are the pursuit of truth. Nuclear weapons are now seen as devoid of any intellectual standing. Of course, the countries have nuclear weapons by the basis of power. That's why India joined the nuclear club, to increase its power. For politically, now we understand this. But I want to address my comment here, particularly in the divinity school, in an academic institution. And I want to bring together morality and intellectuality. And I believe that in the pursuit of truth, which moralists and academics aspire to, they ought to be saying very clearly to the power structures that what you are doing in the perpetuation of nuclear weapons, particularly now, at the end of the Cold War, in this new era that we are staggering through in the 21st century, that to maintain nuclear weapons is without any intellectual basis and without any moral basis. So, coming now to this conference, I flew a long way today, and I tell you, I was inspired to do this because I thought that here we have an opportunity in a prestigious academic setting, in a school of the academic setting that has built up the common word and that has recognized the dangers we face if we're going to have a clash of civilizations, and thus we have to have an alliance of civilizations. We'll talk about this later on. So I would like to make a sort of a plea here tonight that we focus sharply in this conference that nuclear weapons have to be removed from our social, economic, political structure because they are so inimical to truth. The perpetuation of nuclear weapons is a massive lie that is being foisted on a manipulable public that is now driven by the forces of fear post 9/11. Who will raise up the voice of truth in respect of nuclear weapons?
John?
Sorry, I don't mean to be raising my hand precisely in answer to that question, but I do have a comment on this, and it gets back to something that I agree with Paul on, which is the degradation of the dialogue on these issues, and particularly the fact that there really is a gap between what I regard as these far-sighted conservative Cold War thinkers. Conservative really is not the right term here, but just far-sighted thinkers who have had the responsibility of power or responsibility over determining the use of nuclear weapons, who reflected deeply on that experience and I think have learned something from it. I think of the military people who have had the responsibility of being custodians of nuclear weapons and who know better than most of us what wars actually do and also have a very sober view of nuclear weapons. And then I think about the conference that I attended just 4 or 5 months ago with a group of distinguished academics from a very distinguished university just up the road. Starts with an H. And I was amazed at what I heard because this is a group of people who are sitting around thinking about the issues that are going to be on the agenda for this conference as well, and that is how do we achieve security from terrorism, particularly from nuclear terrorism, in the post-Cold War era, in the post-9/11 era. And I thought I was going to hear some very persuasive answers to that. What I heard was that the concept of deterrence needs to be revived. And the way the concept of deterrence can be revived is to issue a public statement by the United States government that if a nuclear weapon is used anywhere under any circumstances, we will respond by nuking Tehran. That was said. Seriously. Now, I at this point raised my hand and I said, wait a minute. What is responsible about this morally? What is conservative about this? Does this make sense? Is this not taking a short-term concern and running huge risks for the fate of the world? What about the precedent of non-use that was established during the Cold War? Don't you attribute any significance to that? The answer was no. Now, I was appalled that this was coming from the people that I would regard as my colleagues, the people in an academic institution sitting around supposed to be thinking about these things. I don't think you would have seen this kind of thing coming from military men. I don't think you would have seen this kind of thing coming from former top-level civilian leaders of the kind that we have been discussing here. I think what you're seeing is a kind of a dialogue that reflects abstraction, it reflects, to some extent, quantification, it reflects an ivory tower that is not really in contact with the real world and that doesn't have much sense of what war is really like. I don't think any of these people have ever read Clausewitz, and I recommend Clausewitz to you. You wouldn't think of Clausewitz as being on the reading list for a conference of this type. But we have him on the reading list for our grand strategy course that we teach here. In fact, he's the centerpiece for that course. And part of the reason is that in his great book on war, his first chapter advances the concept of total war, total violence, total senseless, spasmodic, irrational, purposeless violence. And he holds that out as an abstraction. He holds that out as something that could never have been achieved in his era, which was the early 19th century. But he uses that as the base to make the argument that all power the use of all power must be disciplined by political purposes. And what he means by political purposes are the purposes of the state, and these can include, and certainly should include, morality. They should include restraint. They should include proportionality in the best Catholic tradition. So this is there in Clausewitz. And I think it's not, it's uncanny. It's almost as if he anticipated nuclear weapons. And he provides one of the best theoretical bases for thinking about coming to grips with these issues that we're talking about here, although he's almost never used in that regard. And what really struck me is how much I wish these academic colleagues who had reduced these horrendous issues to a set of equations and then had come out with this kind of solution. This is how deterrence could be achieved. I wish those guys, I wouldn't wish fighting a war on them, but I would wish slogging through Clausewitz, which is in its own way kind of fighting a war.
Rob?
Yes, thank you. I will use this opportunity to take further a question from my 11-year-old son, as I said I would do. Just before I left, he was just asking what I was going to do, and I was saying I'm going here, and the question was the nuclear threat. And he asked me, why do the USA want to stop others from having nuclear weapons when they want to have them themselves? And I think this is, you can ask, is it because the U.S. is kinder, or is it because the U.S. is stronger? It must be one of them, probably. And I think this, in a way, a question that is coming up from an 11-year-old boy is a sign of how the rest of the world in these days ask questions to the USA. For example, why don't you join the International Criminal Court? Why don't you sign the ban on landmines? Why don't you take part in the fight against small arms, and so on and so forth? And I think that when I said that the time of political realism is over, it is because we have to see that we live in a shared world with a shared vulnerability, and if we don't, in a way, come to that conclusion or see that, we will see reactions around the world on different things. For example, if global warming is caused by the emission of carbon dioxide, 25% comes from this country. And it has global consequences, so we have to start to talk together and join in a shared effort to, in a way, meet these challenges. And the spread of nuclear weapons is a part of it. And if we don't, in a way, do that, we will lose respect for each other in a way.
Comment here in the audience.
Ian Smith from Oxford, England. Just perhaps to look at the question another way, nuclear deterrent implies distrust and disrespect, and also a very defensive position. And I guess following on from just the last comment, as a counter to a second nuclear age, would the panel consider an alternative strategy to be one of global collaboration as compared with disarmament? Is this a realistic alternative, would you consider, and if so, what would need to make it happen?
I think this will shock you probably, because it shocks me, but this is what the foreign policy of the United States has been in the post-Cold War era. It's what we thought we were trying to do. Now, at certain times, one has to admit with such a level of ineptitude that it looked like it was being sabotaged by the KGB or something, if they existed. But the worldview of the Clinton administration and the Bush administration is very similar in this regard. It is collaboration, and it is to build an international system of democracies or near democracies that will not go to war with each other. And some of them, it is not the caricature of we like war, we like nuclear weapons. Let's recall the enormous reduction in the size of U.S. nuclear stockpiles by this administration and this president. Let's give him that credit. So the problem has to do with our conceptions of it. So just stating the broad abstract principle of collaboration has led to interpretations which others sharply disagree with, like Iran, North Korea, China, etc. Is that fair?
Yeah, absolutely.
Gentleman here, second row. Microphone is coming.
I wanted to talk about the distinction between the first nuclear age and the second, as you're calling it. When I was a child, it was always in the back of our minds. Every day at noon, the siren would go off, and we would remember. And we would say, well, wouldn't they attack at noon? You know, wouldn't that be the obvious move? Whenever we went to a city, we thought, well, maybe this could be the day. This is a primary target. So it was a constant danger, a constant factor. It could come up at any time in a conversation, symbolized by the minute hand on the clock of the atomic scientists, going back and forth, back and forth. I think the difference is that in this age, it's the difference between a boat in a choppy sea and the Titanic in smooth seas sailing toward the iceberg. There's a trajectory that started a long time ago that's in the process of culminating, and that trajectory involves technology, globalism, et cetera, affecting every area, and essentially squeezing out the slack, squeezing out the margin that separates things from one another, so that an impact of this over here creates global consequences over there. As that progresses inexorably faster and faster, the danger of use of the nuclear weapons becomes greater and greater, in fact, almost inevitable, because part of that is technology getting more accessible. And, you know, instead of having a world free of nukes, we could have a world of almost free nukes. So I think if that were in people's minds, that as things tighten up, as resources are exhausted, this is not just a global warming thing. It's coming from all sides, converging toward a point, and that's the point of maximum danger.
You know, I would largely agree with your characterization. The technology is racing ahead at a speed that it did in the Cold War. We sort of noticed it then. It was pointed out. We're not noticing it now. And it's not just nuclear weapons. The whole information technology revolution and intelligence is producing profound changes. At one level, I think the technology will reach the point where you actually will stir up a consciousness of a political debate and a moral debate about these things. I was on a panel for the National Academy, we reported out in August, all over the political spectrum, right and left. Should we put conventional warheads on Trident missiles inside Trident submarines? Prompt global strike, they call it. And it was the convergence of the opinions of right and left around the decision to go ahead with this was very striking. I think is a real signpost. Congress shot it down because they're mad at Bush for so many things. They're not going to give him anything. But this will go ahead, whoever is elected next. We haven't even begun to figure out the public, and even the expert community doesn't understand the IT revolution, and it's hooking that up with decapitation strikes, which is really the next big thing. That you can do a super version of what we tried to do against Baghdad on a huge scale by hooking up the intelligence with missiles that can reach targets in 10, 15 minutes. Prompt global strike is going to be able to destroy any target on the planet with a conventional warhead in less than 1 hour, from the detection of the target to the president's release. And no one has thought about how is this going to look to China with her 18 ICBMs, that she could be decapitated, remove all of her missiles with a conventional attack. When I go to Beijing, the first thing they say, once you deploy that, we're going to suspend our no first use of nuclear weapons declaration. And you go back to Washington or to certain universities and they say, what do you mean? I didn't know the Chinese had a no first use. It's like, it's really bad out there.
I think it's not quite that bad.
Scott?
Part of what's come up in this conversation is this question of how do we deepen the moral conversation as part of our conversations about strategies. It seems to me one of the ways to do that, perhaps one of the easy places to start, is to return to the just war tradition, to begin to ask with some seriousness, what does it mean to apply this, and to apply it with some stringency, to ask for not only proportionality, but most especially, what does non-combatant immunity mean in the world today, and what would it mean to hold ourselves to that standard? John Paul II made quite clear that he thought the preemptive strike on Iraq was not a just war. It didn't meet the criteria. This rarely happens, that a pope would make a statement quite so specific as this. But this was clearly an instance where he was willing to apply the criteria and say this doesn't fit. And I think that's a place to start to deepen the moral conversation, in part because the language has been there. It's not necessarily been used with much stringency, but it's been there as part of our conversation for some time. And it seems to me this ties into the question of vulnerability, because the just war tradition was precisely about fighting as someone who still understands themselves to be bound by a moral law, that is, to be bound by the calling of God, specifically, as the tradition arose, specifically as a Christian. What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus who goes to war and fights? Are there any limits? And the tradition says, well, yes, there are going to be quite a few limits here. And what that means then is you are going to become more vulnerable as a soldier, because there are some things you can't do. And that seems to me the difficult part, the hard part of the just war tradition that I'm not sure we fully come to grips with. And if we begin to apply that with some seriousness, then we have to say that soldiering under the just war tradition is going to require a level of vulnerability that is difficult, but as I said before, that has something to do with some goods that we think are our higher goods that we want to hold to, and that we're not willing to subvert those goods in order to preserve ourselves. A conversation that's spun out of the just war conversation recently has been a conversation about just policing, which would take too long to go into at the moment, but it's a conversation that's actually happening between just war Christians and pacifist Christians, and trying to find some common ground to talk about just policing. And just to leave you with a question on this, early on, right after 9/11, this was referred to as a crime by the administration. Not long after that, it was being referred to as war. What would have been the difference if we had continued to construe this as a crime?
I wanted to just go back to this point about technology just for a minute, because it's just a different angle on it. But, the issue of technology is used as, in many ways, as an argument against disarmament. The genie's out of the bottle, we can't disinvent the technology. And I think that that's a specious argument. I mean, sure, that's true. You can't disinvent the technology, but there are technological things that have been invented that are not disinvented, but that we find so morally objectionable that they don't exist anymore, like the gas chambers, CFCs, that created this hole in the ozone. We found ways to go around them. So I think that, we have to be careful of those kinds of arguments and bring this whole sort of moral element, that we're talking about here into the conversation.
John, briefly, and then Dawn.
Yeah. Let me just put one thing on the agenda that I hope you'll think about tomorrow. It's kind of interesting. The word democracy hasn't come up so far this evening, I think. And yet we are one in this country. And being a democracy, life would be a lot simpler if there were one single good thing out there. But I think we all know that that's not true. There are competing good things out there. Niebuhr told us this. Isaiah Berlin wrote eloquently about this. And democracy and politics in general means not so much, sometimes it means choosing between good and evil, but more often it means choosing between two goods that you can't have at the same time. Now, I would totally agree, just war theory is a good thing and has been a good thing for almost a couple of thousand years now. But are you going to sell it in Kansas? I mean, are you going to take this notion of saying that our soldiers should become more vulnerable? Is that going to play in Idaho? It's in this country. Got to be sold to the voters, ultimately. And the same issues.
That's true, but at the same time, if we move too quickly to that, then we simply drop the moral conversation almost as soon as we started, because if it's not sellable, then the conversation ends almost right away.
I'm not proposing to move quickly to it. I'm proposing just to keep it on the agenda and let it be a kind of reality check, because that's what this country is, and that's what indeed most countries that we consider to be humane in this international system are democracies. So I would just say part of the dilemma here is how do you take these painful positions, which is what they are, and translate them into the realm of politics? How do they get out of the church and into the political arena in such a way that the leaders who would respect them and who would practice them actually can get elected in this country? And that gets back to the kinds of questions that you've been raising as well, because these are all very good questions. Why does the United States take the position it does on some of these issues, which are very unpopular in the world? The answer is because those positions are popular at home. And so that's a reality that I think we cannot shove under the table. Okay?
And maybe one of the challenges that is remaining here and resurfacing over and over and again is why is it that somehow we are unable to generate a very serious intellectual as well as moral debate? I think Paul has been raising this question. We've been also hearing of the pressures of facing the monster, looking the monster in the eyes in the form of H-bomb, as well as other things that are happening. But maybe something for us to discuss and to reflect on it is, and I think, Paul, that's how you ended partly your comments, is how does one place kind of sort of retrieve the seriousness of the discussion, seriousness of this discussion in circles like this one, but also seriousness of the public discussion around this, and maybe then it might be able to play also in Kansas, in Iowa, but we have no chance in a sense to put it up as a serious discussion. I have Dawn there in the back wanting to ask a question.
Yeah, thanks. I think the first thing would be to say I'm not sure that that the nation has to only function by a utilitarian calculus. To give ourselves over to that too quickly, I think, is to lose the battle right away. But to step back a moment, I think you're exactly right that there's a kind of gap to leap here, and the place to begin might be asking how do Christians within their own small political communities that we call the church, the parish, the congregation, how do these communities begin to think about embodying something of the call of Jesus in a sort of substantive, maybe even radical way? All right, we may not become that Amish community, but we may also recognize that the call of Jesus upon us means that we're going to need to live differently. Let me suggest, in the case of a just war Christian, it may be that in fact that just war doctrine doesn't sell in Kansas, but it may be that in the context of our congregations, we come to understand that we can only serve in a situation where these limits are going to be acknowledged. And if those limits are not acknowledged, we can't serve. So that it becomes not simply the pacifists who say conscientious objection, but that in fact other Christians who take the just war tradition quite seriously might say in particular cases, I can't be a part of this. Now in fact, conscientious objection today can't work that way, which is part of the problem, and it becomes part of a problem, especially, say, in the Catholic situation recently, where John Paul II says this is not a just war, and yet you have Catholics serving in this war. I mean, they're put in this very difficult position. So that seems to me a place to start, though, is to start with the community of people who actually share a certain kind of ethic, a certain sense of what is the good we seek. And then beyond that, I think it's a matter of thinking about how political discourse and debate ought to happen. I made a brief reference to Jeff Stout. I think folks like Jeff Stout, Ramon Coles, there are a number of people thinking democracy in fresh ways, thinking democracy beyond liberalism in a way that would encourage us and hopefully create space for more particularist religious convictions about the good to be brought into the public debate as distinctive religious convictions. That doesn't mean they're going to win the day, but it means that we don't have the presumption right up front that I have to translate my religious convictions into a utilitarian calculus before it gets a public hearing.
Skip.
As a local church pastor, I think I see a connection between many of the concerns of why are Americans the way they are, will it sell in Kansas, the breakdown of the intellectual community's level of discourse, the opportunities in local churches, why don't universities speak truth into the system. There's a breakdown of a link between our academic elites and our religious elites and transformation in local communities. And this is not advanced if these kind of circles don't become accessible in a way into local churches and local conversations, or if the academic conversation becomes simply partisan K Street type sword fighting. So I wonder if there's any thoughts on the panel how the kind of To take just the just war theory, for instance, I would imagine that part of the reason the Catholic community was influential in speaking into policy circles was because bishops actually could deliver votes. Politics is really quite simple. I mean, the people in the pews either will follow their leaders or they have no idea what the leaders are saying and are quite unaffected by them. Is there a way in which these conversations can be more directly pressed accessibly into Kansas, New Haven, New Canaan, etc., in ways that I think they were in the 50s and the 60s?
I mean, I agree with the thrust of your question. I don't want to pre-label something as controversial. If Cardinal Spellman had not supported the Vietnam War the way he did, I mean, it really would have made a major difference had the church come out against the Vietnam War. But he did support that. And well, I heard Ed Koch last night, and he related that his biggest single block of voters when he ran for 3 times in mayor was the Catholic vote. He got 81% of the Catholic vote and only 61% of the Jewish vote. All right? And he was running, it was after Vietnam, admittedly, but I think there is a definite connection there. Not direct, perhaps, but important. And, you know, if the Catholic cardinal calls, you will pick up the phone. And if the Catholic cardinal was on the pastoral letter on War and Peace in the early 1980s, it will make a difference.
I would just add, if Soviets and Americans who were involved most deeply with these weapons could suddenly begin thinking similarly as they did in the early 50s, then maybe it is possible to move Kansas or whatever. Miracles do happen. Rarely. But it is possible. And as we all know, God moves mysteriously. Think about the means by which that miracle back then, 1952, 53, happened. Think about the instrument for that miracle, which is what it was. It was the H-bomb. Very mysterious.
Well, I was going to add, too, that priests and bishops still have a tremendous amount of influence over their senators. I mean, we were doing work with Senator Lugar in Indiana. He's extremely influenced by the Catholic community. You can look back to the vote around the Chemical Weapons Convention. Now, that's a little bit in the past, but they were absolutely votes that were delivered by the Catholic community. So that's, you know, behind, I mean, Tyler, you might even want to say a couple words about what you're doing, but the thinking behind organizations like Faithful Security is how do you educate, how do you start a deep, rich conversation at the community level about these issues and spread that out from parish to parish, congregation to congregation, and work with the religious leaders. They have a tremendous amount of political influence, and I think that's, you know, that's one of the answers.
And on this encouraging note about trying to find multiple ways in which we can bring serious discussion of this issue into various spheres and realms, I think we need to conclude our evening. Join me thanking our panel.
Thank you very much.